Okay, I think we should get started. We look like we have a nice group that's joined us so far. Hello, everyone. My name is Sylvia Ehrlich, and I'm president of a company called Intrepid Relocation International. We're a destination services company, and I have with us Sasha DeWind, who is CEO of Tutor Associates, and Jennifer Bush, who is running the what is your title, Jennifer? I'm sorry, is it president? I
President.
apologize. Yeah, it was president of VJB and Associates, Virginia Bush, who was the founder, and they are a company that specializes in education consulting. And Sasha's company, Tutor Associates, obviously is helping with prepping children and tutoring them. We're going to talk today about demystifying the high school application process and the testing process for that. And with that, I'd like to start with you, Jennifer, if you would just give us a bit of an overview about the application process, about compiling a strong school list, and where you go from there.
So basically, families will start working on the application process usually about a year before the child is accepted. So if you work back from March, they would start the March before they get accepted. And what we find is often with New York City families, there's definitely a trend where New York City families are applying to day school and boarding school just to basically have more options. So that's sort of an interesting piece of information, what we're finding in trends. Now, in terms of how to consider approaching this, you really have to know your child and kind of leave your ego to the side a little bit and really understand what their interests are, what their goals are, and then try to find schools that are going to match that.
Okay. And are there certain parts of the application process, or is there anything that they should be knowing when they're looking at compiling the schools in addition
Sure.
to that?
We usually say that there are 5 parts. There's definitely the transcripts. So they look at the last 2 years of transcripts. Student interviews are very important. The essays are very important. It's really important for kids to be able to talk about themselves. So the interviewer can visualize what that child's going to be like on that campus, both academically, but also outside the classroom. And I would say the essays are just an extension of that. The students, the ones that seem most successful are the ones that are really digging deep into those essay questions and talking about themselves and showing that reader how they fit on that campus. And then of course your extracurricular activities are very important, and the testing, which is Sasha's.
Which segues us over to Sasha. Yes,
Yeah.
Sasha, could you tell us a little bit about admissions testing and the challenges and realities of all that entails?
Of course, yeah. So, there are two main admissions tests that high schools accept, and those are called the SSAT, the Secondary School Admissions Test, and the ISEE, the Independent School Entrance Exam. And while traditionally day schools sort of had a preference for the IC and boarding for the SSAT at this point, pretty much everyone takes either test, and you'll see that on their websites. And during COVID, most schools, if not all, went test optional. They were understanding of the difficulties that families faced during that time, but we've slowly seen that has that schools have returned to either requiring testing or at least having it be optional. And in the day school scene, so in the New York City independent day school scene, almost everyone has returned to requiring either the SSAT or the IC. And in the boarding school world, it's still a bit of a mixed bag, but the more competitive the school, the more likely they are to require one or the other. And we're seeing a sort of general trend towards a return to testing. And I do say either or. Please don't make your child do both of these tests. They are comparable admissions exams, but
is there a significance between either test, or is there one test that might work for some children versus others?
Yeah, they really are equal tests. I mean, they both test reading comprehension. They both test quantitative reasoning or mathematics in some way. They both test verbal reasoning, which is really vocabulary, but they both have an essay, a sort of in-person essay. They do so in different ways. They have different ways of testing those basic skills. And so some kids prefer one and some kids prefer the other. And you know, determining which test is right for your child, you know, when Jen talked about that March timeline, that sort of March before you apply, somewhere in that range of that sort of spring season or the summer preceding the application season, that's the time for your child to decide which test they're taking, to try one or the other or both as in a practice context, decide which one they're taking and then just focus on that one. And you know, I don't think there's one that's easier or harder. I think they're easier or harder in different ways. And I'll dive into some examples as we get into them further, but some kids prefer one and some kids prefer the other.
Thank you. And Jen, getting back to the key parts of the application, when we're talking about the testing, and what other pieces of the puzzle do parents have to know and be prepared to work with their children to help them put them in best light?
So one thing I just want to touch on is I think Sasha's really wise to say it's really good to do that first test, maybe test both. But the reason for that from our perspective is it's really nice to have a baseline to understand, you know, what the starting point is for those test scores, and then to go from there and understand what the weaknesses are and where the strengths lie. In terms of your question, I think that it's really, you know, the key interesting part about this is like the what we were talking about before, like the interview. That's a very important part. I would say don't over prep your children. That's a really bad idea. Don't get like your friend from MIT to interview your 14-year-old. Really bad idea. We do test prep, and sorry, not test prep, interview prep, but we do it in a very organic way. And it's once we get to know the student really well that we can do that successfully. I think one thing that parents should have a heads up to also is the idea of recommendations. These are teacher recommendations, and either the principal, head of year, ex-counselor out who writes these recommendations. We usually say, go and talk to your teachers in maybe around Thanksgiving time. And that's a really good touch point. So the teachers get to know the students well before they're writing a recommendation for them to leave. So that's something that's really important to know about beforehand.
What about the essay?
The essays are really
both of you.
Yeah, the essays
subject
are
of the
really important. I think one of the things that families think of is, oh, their essay is not a big deal. The application isn't due till January 15th. It's, you know, September. They have all term plus Thanksgiving and Christmas. There's never been a time in December that we've had like complete done essays on any child. Even though parents are like, they'll be done by Thanksgiving. It just doesn't happen. Kids get busy, and you know, that term is really, really important. They've got their sports, they've got their leadership, they've got their grades to contend with. This is stuff they do after school and on break. So, you know, definitely give yourself the time, give your child the time to explore that and do that appropriately.
And I think, you know, Jen was mentioning, you know, not over prepping your child. I think it's important to realize this is very different than kindergarten. It's the same thing with the test prep. I mean, they're not ready for college yet. They're still young teenagers, but they are the ones who really need to shine in this process. So as a parent, it may feel uncomfortable to take a little bit of the back seat, and you can keep your child organized, and you can stay organized, and you can get them situated and positioned for success. But ultimately, as Jen knows so well, it's the child's essay, the child's interview, the child's voice that is so sort of central in this process. And their scores, they're taking the test. So
yeah, and I think one thing sorry, just if I could interject one thing, I think one thing that becomes apparent through this whole process is that, you know, these schools do care about the parents too. They want good families. They want families that are going to support their children. So I think that, you know, oftentimes people think there's some magical way to do this. If you can just be natural in the process and be yourself, it really is amazing where you end up.
I was just going to say there's some parents that are so intense that I'm aware of some of our clients where the parents have actually attempted to write the essays for their children. What do you say about that?
I say that's a big no-no. I would definitely not recommend that.
Right, because it's very clear, I think, to the admissions person that is not being written by the student.
Yeah, very much so. And also there is a portion of the application that is dedicated to the parents where the parents have to write parent statements about their children.
Right.
And that's really their time to, fill in any gaps they feel that are in the application or go a little bit deeper on something that the child hasn't addressed. But that's a great opportunity for the parents to do that.
Yeah, and Sasha, do you want to tell us about how children prepare for, we were just talking about how they prepare or don't prepare for an interview. What about preparing for the tests themselves?
Yeah,
And what would you consider a score?
Sure. So as Jen mentioned, the baseline is sort of where you start, right? You need to have that baseline so that you can understand if your child is improving. And then I like to break the test into sort of 3 different categories. And even if the 3 of us sort of prepare for this test, it's the same 3 categories that I think leads to true mastery of these exams. And I do think of these exams as sort of a foreign language. You may not know how to speak fluently now, but you can learn to become fluent in these exams. So the first piece is the content. There's no getting around it. You certainly need to learn vocabulary, and you need to make sure your math fundamentals are there and the reading skills. And while we work with children on that piece of the puzzle, I would say that given the schools our kids are overwhelmingly coming from, their content tends to be pretty strong. Yes, they study vocabulary. Yes, they forget how to do certain things in math. But I would say that first piece out of 3 is actually usually the one that's the strongest. And parents are often worried, why is my child only in the 40th percentile? She's an A student. Well, it's because she is really smart and she does have the capacity to do well, but there's these other 2 pieces. So piece number 2 is what I call patterns and procedures. You need to understand the way this language functions. How is it structured? What are the traps? What are the strategies or procedures that you use or you can employ to navigate the patterns given to you in the test? So getting a child really familiar with every aspect, big and small, of that exam is a really big piece of sort of narrowing the gap between a child's capacity and the scores that they're expecting. And then the final piece, and I think this can be sort of understated, is performance. It is sort of a performance. You have to show up on game day just like you do for a tennis match or a musical theater performance, and you have to perform. And these are young adolescents. They are often inexperienced at that. They get anxious, they get tired, they get distracted by the annoying kid next to them who's chewing gum. And all of these sort of inevitable thoughts and feelings that accompany sort of high stakes testing. It's not that high stakes. We'll talk about that in a moment. But what feels like high stakes to our children makes such a difference in terms of their performance. And I always say a child who has category 1 and category 2 in good shape, but doesn't know how to manage those thoughts and feelings is still not going to hit those scores. And what scores are we looking for? Well, I know Jen will certainly back me up on this. It really depends on the school. These schools, first of all, I just want to say this is only one piece of the puzzle. You heard Jen mention all the other things that go into the application, and the scores should really kind of match the rest of the application. So they want to see, in certain schools, sure, they want to see percentiles in the 80s and 90s, or even in the 90s, or that's what they're expecting to see. Does that mean you can't get in without those scores? No, they really do get to know your child, but that may be what certain schools would sort of expect. And then there are other schools who are really happy with percentiles in the 60s or 70s, and it goes down from there. And I just want to clarify, when I say percentiles, and I make this very clear to parents, we're not talking percents, right? A 75th percentile is not a C. It means you did better than 75% of the kids in that cohort, in that age group, applying from private schools. So it's a very selective group of kids that you're comparing yourself to in that percentile. And that's why there are many schools who are very happy with percentiles in the 70s or even the 80s. So I would say it depends on where you're applying, what a good score is. And it certainly depends on where your child's starting, how likely those scores are. But if you can master the content, which again, most of our kids come to us with a good chunk of that under their belt, if you can understand the patterns and procedures of these exams, and then you can perform under pressure, which they're 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, that's not so easy always, then you should be able to hit scores that are commensurate with your capacity and in your sort of regular academic life.
That's great. That's great to know and very helpful. And before we continue, since we have a large contingency now that have come on board to this session, I just want to let everybody know that there is a quick Q&A option. And if you want to remain anonymous, you can do that. And if you have questions, please submit them in that Q&A chat, not the chat itself, but the Q&A box. And we will try to address as many of those towards the end of the session as possible. So hopefully that will be done. And you can always reach out afterwards as well. So Jen, tell me a little bit about when we have these scores now, they'll give you an indication of where your students are going to be. And you've talked about the fact that you're trying to figure out what's best for your child. And now you also have the scoring to give you an indication of where they might also have better viability. Could you talk about that a little bit and
Sure.
and what other pieces could help? Thanks.
Sure. I mean, usually families will come to us right around the same time that they're taking their first test as a practice. So, March before the year they apply, or they'll come to us during the summer. But I think, really before we even get into the test scores, what we're looking at are the teacher comments, the grades, the last 2 years of transcripts. We interview the child, we interview the parent. The idea is to put a really balanced school list together. So testing is definitely an important part of that. And usually it will back up what we're reading in the teacher comments and the grades. So it's a very important piece, but it's another piece of the pie. It's another way to look at the jigsaw puzzle, and it helps just confirm to us what that school list should look like. Just like Sasha was saying, there's schools that want, 90th percentile. There's schools that are okay with 50th percentile. They're more interested in who the kid is all about. And chances are they have a great support center for kids that don't test well. There are things that make up these schools that are very individual, and that's what's important with finding the right school list.
Now you mentioned something about teachers' comments. What about teachers' recommendations? Are those important when putting together your package, as I would call it, your profile or your folder for the applications?
Yes, they're very important. They're extremely important. They're something that is often not seen. They're confidential. And you hope that they're very good, and most of the time you have a pretty good read on them, but sometimes they can actually kill an application too. So they are taken very seriously.
You have to be very careful about who you're reaching out to create that recommendation. Is that what you're saying, or it is?
Well, you actually don't have the choice. It has to be math, it has to be English. Sometimes you're offered a choice of a third teacher. And then it's either the head of the school or some authoritative position that's usually talking to all the teachers and getting information about you.
Okay, very good. We're getting some questions, so I'm just sort of previewing them as we go along as well. And what about when parents have to decide? It's become, I think, when we were discussing this earlier, you were mentioning that there's sort of a discussion going on between boarding and day schools and how people are coming to terms with that. Could you address that a little bit for us, Jen?
Sure, Sasha, I'm sure you've seen this too, right? Like, do you take the SSAT or do you take the IC? I think traditionally people were much more geared towards knowing exactly what they wanted for their child. Like they knew they were going to boarding school and it was a done deal after 8th grade. That's where they were going in 9th grade or 10th grade. I think now people are keeping their kids home. I think there is a trend to keep their kids home. But a lot of the schools in New York City and also in the surrounding areas end in 9th grade. So where do you go? Like the day schools are really full, and the more competitive ones are really, really full. So, they're applying out to other areas we see day students as far as like New Jersey, believe it or not, from New York City going to New Jersey for day school. We also see kids that would traditionally be a day student applying to boarding school.
Yeah, and I saw in the, there's also for 10th grade, because there are people who stay for 9th grade, right? And then we see those kids come to us for SSAT or IC as well, and they're applying out for 10th, and there really aren't spots at the day school. So they are almost exclusively applying to boarding schools. There just aren't, I mean, unless there might be a spot or two at a random place here or there, someone moves, someone goes, and then, but they sort of have to go boarding at that point. So I think that's also a consideration. But as Jen said, parents want options, and so they're often widening the scope. And I think that's smart, right? Then you have more options and you can explore more things for your child. And boarding can be a really compelling choice. Yeah,
sometimes they go out thinking they're a day student and they end up as a boarding student. So you just never know. And the deadlines for day school are a bit different. So that's something to keep in mind. They're not the same deadlines as the boarding school deadlines.
So it's important to be aware of that as well. Mm-hmm. Now, with the scoring, with the testing and doing the early testing, Sasha, is there a possibility that you can take the test as sort of like a preliminary test to see where you score and then see where your weak spots are and to get some help to build your strengths?
Yeah, so before the season starts, which we'll kind of say is August preceding your, let's say it's 8th grade applying for 9th, or if it's 9th applying for 10th, but like August 1st is sort of when you can start to register for your official SSATs or your official ISE. So these are not practice tests that you take at Tutor Associates, which is what most of our kids do when they're trying to figure out which test to take. Can you take an official one? Absolutely. And there are lots of K-8 schools that actually give their 7th graders official middle level tests. But the upper level test, the real official test that you're taking as an 8th grader or a 9th grader, that you sort of register in August and you're taking them in the fall. And the tests are different. One of the only reasons I prefer the SSAT, frankly, is that they give kids more options for testing. You can sign up for in October, November, December, even early January, though that's for the late kids usually. And they give a flex test, a sort of any time in those 6 months. You can just take a test outside of those dates. Yeah. Oh, and Jen, there you go. Jen offers those flex tests, so you can take them with her in her office. So the SSAT gives you a lot of flexibility, and when it comes time to register your child, many of you may have already registered them. You don't want scores to go directly to the schools to which you're applying. They just go to you. So you get to look at those October scores and maybe those November scores, and no one sees them until you release them and send them off. And I'll get back to that in a moment, but the reason I'm saying that is the SSAT gives you lots of chances. And should your child take this test 6 times? No, they should find a company and they should take practice tests, and they should, when they're ready and feeling confident and good, that's when they should take the official test. And I would say most kids take it twice. Some are done in 1, maybe some take it 3 times, but on average, they're taking the SSAT 2 times.
When do you send the? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I'll get back to sending in a moment, but the ISE, they only let you take it twice in a sort of the fall season. So you can take it once through November. So our kids take it in October, November, and then once December through February. But I mean, the season's over really January 15th. So that means December really. So the IC is much more limiting at the moment in terms of how many times you can test. Now, again, they're not usually taking it more than twice, but it just has fewer, you just can't take it 3 times or 4 times. And in terms of sending the scores, it's the last thing the schools need, really. So once you've seen all your scores, you can decide, okay, sometime before their final deadline, usually that's January 15th, sometimes it's January 9th, January 4th, whatever it is, that's when, and Jen can tell you more details about that, but that's when they require the final application to be submitted, and that includes scores. And so that's sort of when you would send them. And some families decide to send 2 sets of scores. Some decide to send only November because it was better than October. And just to be clear, if you send your scores, they see everything in that day. So if you're really great in reading comprehension on your November SSAT, and then your reading drops a little, but your math and your verbal are really strong in December, and you decide to send both, they see everything. They're not mixing and matching. And it may be strategically wise to send 2 sets of scores. Maybe they show your strengths, but it may actually just be best to choose one, even if it means forgoing a lower score. Same thing goes for the ISEE. You take it twice, you can send 2 sets of scores, or you can send 1 set of scores, but you want to have control over that until you've seen everything, all the data points that your child has provided by sitting and taking these at least 3-hour tests, depending on if they have accommodations.
Wow. Well, I think if they pass those, they should be accepted. Jen, you were saying something, you were mentioning that you do help with the testing or the practice testing.
Yes, I have a colleague who administers the flex test. So they can just email us, and it's a flex test is basically it's the SSAT, but it's done on the student's time frame. And they do it
Now,
alone and not in a room with 30 other people. But you can only have
At
one
one
a year.
okay, that's good. Now, one time, Jen, legacies were very important in a lot of schools. Are they still?
So this is an interesting question. I don't think that that they are as important now as they used to be. But it leads into another question that I just saw pop up, which is it important for a legacy or a friend who's an alum to write a letter on the student's behalf? I would say if the alum knows that student very, very well, then it can really be a good thing for the file, for the application file. But if he doesn't or she doesn't, I wouldn't bother. Their second part of that question is, if they write that letter, is the child expected to go? Yes, they are. Absolutely. Because that alum can only write so many letters before his stock credit kind of goes down if these kids don't end up going to that school.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. So, in what way, Jen, can a consultant help with the family making some of these decisions, filtering out?
So I think, we've already talked about how we help with the test prep. We critique the essays, we help with parent statements, we help with the online portals. But I think in the bigger picture of everything, what we're really teaching the student is confidence and how to advocate for themselves and how to take ownership of this process. We do advocate on behalf of the child during the reading period and before they get to the campuses to explain to admissions why we've picked that certain school. But I really think at the end of this process, kids are set up very, very well for entering boarding school. They know how to write essays. They know how to speak to people properly. They just arrive on campus a lot more confident.
And I would say the
with the
same thing about
tests-
the tests. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I don't love these tests. I mean, they're standardized tests and they're stressful, and I don't like stressing out 12 and 13-year-olds or 14-year-olds. But just like Jen said, by the end of the process, if it's done correctly, and I hear this time and time again about the work with my tutors, they realize their own capacity on these standardized tests. They understand what it is to beat them. And the stakes get much higher for college admissions. As Jen's been saying, this is just one piece of this puzzle, and it's a smaller piece in the high school admissions process than it is in the college admissions process. And so it's a nice, just like she's saying that they know how to shake a hand and make eye contact and speak about themselves thoughtfully in the interview. They also learn their own capacity to become fluent in something that maybe they didn't realize they could become fluent in. And I think there's value to that process, despite
Sure.
the ickiness of the test sometimes.
And Jen, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think, I guess in parting, what I would say is just know your child. Know their strengths, know their weaknesses. When you do put together a school list, which, is something we really work hard with families on, make sure that school really can support that child, but also challenge their strengths, and really get them to a place where they're going to feel confident going on to the next stage in their life.
And as a consultant helping them, what do you think that key role is? How can you what is your value added in many
Sure.
ways? I'm going to ask that question to both of you. So what is your value added?
Good question. I think what is really unique is this age. because you're entering the whole teenage everything. And I think sometimes it's very valuable to have a third party between the parent and the student. We see our students in a very different light than their parents sometimes see them. And oftentimes a very different light than one parent versus the other parent sees them. So, I really think that starts initially with the school list. And when you get on these campuses and we ask the kids to write down like 5 pros and cons, and we ask the parents to do the same thing and not to share it with each other until after they've done it. So I think, it's like getting everybody on the same page and figuring out what the best objective is for the child.
Okay. And what would you say, Sasha, from your perspective, would be a
Well,
value
I think
added?
sure. I
The
mean,
tutor-
of course. I mean, I think, especially at this age, I mean, it's funny because as our kids grow up and then they get to GRE and GMAT, I can see how self-studying becomes really much more typical, right? As your brain develops, as your own sense of executive functioning grows, of course you can do this, but familiarity with these tests, and I want to give a couple examples, but please don't tutor your own children. Honestly, it's better if they self-study because it's not about teaching them math or teaching them to read. They really honestly are generally pretty strong in those areas. That's why they're bringing home grades from top schools. It's about teaching them these tests, and it's about providing them with someone who makes them feel safe enough to fail. You can't learn if you're not able to fail in front of someone you feel safe in. So my tutors, and I think there's lots of amazing tutors in this world, not just mine. And there are people who connect with the child in front of them. And each child needs a different approach. We have children who need someone so gentle and someone who needs someone a little bit more like a coach, right? Who keeps them on their toes or keeps them focused. So I think it is about surrounding them with a robust team of supportive grownups who are not always you, especially at this age. That's where Jen comes in. That's where my tutors come in. Like, I mean, I have kids. They listen to other people sometimes when they don't listen to us. And I wanted to give an example of a way in which you might. So many parents get worried when their scores, the initial scores, come back lower than expected. And I wanted to give an example of sort of how a child might be really, really strong reader, for example, or have a strong vocabulary and still miss something. So here's an example from an SSAT, and here's where my tutors, I think, would come in and be an added value. So the example is the word replica. That's the synonym they give you as a child, which I think a lot of our 7th and 8th graders know what a replica is. They've seen replicas of spaceships, or what I'm thinking about my daughter, and dinosaurs, right? They've seen replicas, they've heard it, maybe they read it, but here are the answer choices I'll give you, and you guys can decide how easy or difficult you think this is. So answer choice A is a dividend, probably not even a word they've seen. 2 is fake, which sounds very, I think, tempting. C is a decoy. That's also sounding tempting to me. D is a counterfeit. Wait, all of these are sounding tempting. And then E is a facsimile. Now, the correct answer is facsimile, a word that I don't know any 7th or 8th grader that knows that word. And the ability to pick the answer choice, they don't even know what that means, but they know it's right because they understand the patterns of the test. In fact, before they've looked at the answer choice, maybe they've defined replica in their mind, and then they've moved through the answer choices in a strategic way, understanding that actually a lot of those words are very similar to each other. They probably can't all be right if they're all, or none of them can be right if they all sound so similar. And having the confidence to narrow things down and choose between dividend, because they just don't know what that means, and facsimile, which they also don't know. These are the kinds of ways in which your child who reads beautifully and understands words in context, I would be tripped up by something like that. And I think we have to understand the way these tests function in order for us to understand why our children need help on them. And of course, our tutors and other tutors too, all they do is know these tests back and forth, front, right? And so they can introduce these patterns, they can create procedures around them. Every time I see a synonym, I do this. Every time I see an analogy, I do that. Every time I see a variable in the answer choice, I do this. And those are very different than understanding, a vocabulary word or being able to read at a high level. So you can see how these icky test. That's why I'm not a fan of the tests. I'm a fan of the support around the test. And I think that's where the value is added. Plus, you don't have to fight with your child if you hire Jen, or if you hire a tutor. You can release some tension and make this process a process of discovery and of you know, some joy, dare I say, and not just clashing.
Yeah, Jen, how do you find that with families and children? I know you mentioned something before as well to that degree, but acting as sort of an intermediary or advocate for the child, and maybe in some cases for the parent with the child, so that they have an understanding.
I mean, we definitely get letters at the end of the season from families that are happy with the services, happy where their child got in, but most importantly, they've seen a different side of their child. They've seen an amazing amount of growth, and they've experienced it side by side with them rather than always being the disciplinarian. They've sort of watched that child grow through that child's eyes. So I think that's, you know, it's always very rewarding for us to see that as well, and for that to be acknowledged.
That's great. That's great. And do you have, what I'm going to revert to now is a lot has been happening since COVID, and with COVID, have you seen any changes or anything that's evolved that would be important for parents to be aware of or students to be aware of? And I'll ask you, Jan, first, and then go to Sasha.
Sure. I think the few things that we've seen, I think, you know, the whole COVID situation was a big test for a lot of people, and how to navigate this whole process. And I think that one of the things that we've seen change is that some schools have gone to online interviews. You can't interview in person. You can go and see the school, and tour the school and do it through a tour guide, but you can't interview on campus. So that's one change. Another change is most recently, and I don't think, I'm sorry.
I said, are they still doing that, or has it opened up a little bit more now?
They've done it since COVID, actually. So I think that's there to stay. Not all schools, but some schools. And then the other thing that's happened recently is there's a section in the application that's interest in activities, and everybody talks about kids being well-rounded, and you know, it's a huge part of the application, and to list everything that they're good at, and leadership and community service and sports and arts and, you know, everything. And now they're only letting you list 4 activities. So that's a bit of a challenge, and that's this year. So the big question is, how do you get across the other things that you're really good at or that you're passionate about? So that comes through now in essays, interviews, maybe an attachment somewhere, maybe a video link. So that's a little tricky. So that's something we're navigating this year.
Very interesting. And something.
Yeah, on my end, the tests themselves have stayed the same. I mentioned earlier that there was this real shift to test optional. And what test optional really means for those who are applying to a school like Kent or Millbrook, that's, you know, they still don't require tests, is send good scores. So if you don't, they will truly consider your application if you don't send scores. So please send good scores, and good meaning good for that school. And you know, certainly I can always chat with you when it comes to the testing, or Jen in the bigger picture about what good scores mean for a given school. So test optional means send good scores. Test blind, there's only one that I know of. It's Trevor Day in the city. They're test blind. They will not take your scores. And everyone else really requires them at this point. So that's the big shift, right? The shift to test optional, and then the slow shift away from test optional. I will say the big like news in our industry, which is so funny because it's only exciting or talk of the town to someone like me, but the EMA, which is the group or the business who oversees the SSAT, and the ERB, who do the CTPs and the ISCEs, they've announced a merger. This is not going to affect your children this year, and frankly, we don't know when it's going to affect our children, because they've only just put out a very vague press release, and they haven't finished the merger, and certainly we don't know exactly what that means. But what it hypothetically means is that the 2 tests that I've been discussing, the ISCE and the SSAT, and then the CTPs, which we don't need to talk about, those aren't for admissions, they're going to be one test. So presumably, if this all pans out, you will have one test to pick from, so one test, and it will be some sort of amalgamation of these two tests, right? And they're going to have to fight it out to see what stays and what goes, and how the scoring will work. And they haven't released any details. Now, again, if your child is currently in admission season, this does not affect you. Okay, this is for the future. If your child is considering applying out in future years, well, stay tuned. It's my job to stay tuned for you. And then as soon as they release information, it's our job to make sure that we have adequate diagnostic testing. And this is why I just don't like when these tests change, but that's sort of what's in the water for the future, is a potential or likely merger between these two historically competing tests. And I did quickly want to come back to sending the scores. I did see a question about sending scores and how quickly you get them. They get you, your child takes the test on a Saturday usually, and you get them back within 3 days, I think, for the IC, and within something like 8 for the SSAT. So you do have those scores long before you have to take the test again or decide to sort of whether or not you're taking that second date. And I will say spots go quickly. So register your child, book a flex test with Jen if you haven't found a spot at another school. But you will see those results pretty quickly in terms of making decisions about retesting, things like that.
Okay, good. Now, there are some questions that have come through, and there's a number of them. So I'd love to be able to go through these with you. I think you've addressed a little bit of some, but let's take them from the, I think we go from the bottom up, right? No, yeah, yes. The first is, do you have an approach, or how do you approach curricular activities for your kid if they only have a couple of interests?
That's a hard question to answer. Call us. Yeah, that is we
That's
struggle.
creative, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's when we talk to the family and talk about, what the goal really is. Are they, obviously having more interest can help on an application, but is the reason they're going to boarding school in order to have more extracurricular activities? Like, what's the end goal there? And so that would probably be a more personalized answer.
So it would depend on the child, the program, the type of school that makes the most.
Sure, his
All right.
level of
Hopefully,
maturity, level of maturity, how old they are, when thinking of applying.
So if you have a child that doesn't have a lot of maybe tick off a lot of the boxes that normally one would see or hear about, should you start with a consultant and a tutor earlier than you would normally, maybe a year or two before that, so that they have a chance to understand what's needed and prep for that? Would that make sense?
So one of the things that we offer is a mentoring program prior to the application process. And that's really, it's like we're the mentor. The child is talking to us about what they like in school, what they don't like, and we're saying to them, well, have you explored this? Like you say you like robotics. Why don't you see what's happening in the local, your local town or your local city, about how to do some sort of thing after school that shows your interest in that outside of the classroom. I think that, that can be very useful. I don't think boarding schools, I think if your child is in 6th grade, I don't think boarding schools are going to be looking at 6th grade thinking that this child has to have, all extracurricular activities possible. I think they also look at New York City kids and realize that, the athletics is not going to be what it is in the country, in the surrounding, tri-state area, just because they don't have the access to it. So, they're looking for different things in different kids who are located in different places.
Okay.
And I just wanted to jump in, Jen, because I'm interested in this too, but I think, different boarding schools have different athletic offerings, right? There are some schools that require you to be an athlete when you're there, but that means they have lots of different things for you to try. And there are other ones where, the teams are quite competitive and your child may not be able to do a sport if they are coming in sort of at a more junior level. Is that right, Jen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the
I mean, they
next-
all have to do sports, but I think they don't all have to be on team sports. They can be a manager of a team sport. They can do calisthenics for a fall term. You know, it really depends on the school.
I'd be the manager of the team sport over here.
It's
I
always
was in,
better
you
to
can't be
be
the mascot, but you can be the manager.
Okay. Well, that shows leadership skills. So
Right.
the next question is, when do you get ISEE scores back? Do you know what the timelines would be on those?
I'm muted. Those are pretty quick. So about 3 days for the ISEE, and I think a little over a week, 8 days for the SSAT. And if I should mention during COVID, another thing that happened, which is not so popular today, is that you did have these tests go digital, which means you could take them at home through this sort of online proctor. And I should just note that, we tend to recommend that children take these tests on paper, either at a school or in a flex test environment. Then they can practice that way. And there's sort of some issues with the automation. But if your child does take an online test, either through a Prometric testing center or at home, well, I believe the results are immediate in that case, because it's digital, it's online. But the large majority of our kids are taking paper tests, and they're submitting the bubble sheet and the test at the testing center or the school where they're testing, and then it's within the week you receive the scores, and that really does allow you and your child time to figure out the game plan for the next official test if you're already signed up. And again, get that spot before I always tell, book the October, November, and December. You don't have to take all of them, but you want that spot, especially because, as Jen knows, kids are always getting busy with boarding school, visits, and they're off doing things. And so their weekends fill up really quickly. So I always say August 1st, that's when we send out our newsletter being like, book your kids those spots, and then you can pick and choose. If you don't show up, the worst thing is you've lost your registration fee, which, I get it, but it's worth it to get the spot. If your kid is one and done in October, you don't have to sit and take November and December, but it's good to have that as a backup plan, because you just don't know how the fall is going to go. You don't know when their tournaments and their bat mitzvahs and there's just so much going on in the fall of your admission season. It's a busy time for us.
Busy time.
Yeah, now if somebody is overseas and their child has to test, I think that online option sounds like it might be a good one if there's not a facility available near them. Would that be something to think about?
Sure. And I will say in different states, even, I mean, most of our students are in the Northeast, but we've had kids all over the country and certainly all over the world. And I will say that sometimes they pick the test based on which one they can get a spot for. So some kids prefer the ISEE, some prefer the SSAT, but we all prefer the one we can actually logistically take. And because they are comparable exams, it is like, you can teach a child either language, right? Maybe one is a little harder in this way, but it's a little easier in another way. So booking those tests early and often is my recommendation. And I think that's my recommendation for all of this. Parents will say, is it too early, January of 7th grade, to start tutoring? And I say, probably, but maybe not. It's never too early to figure out where you are. It may be too early to start tutoring. You don't want them to burn out. They may not need much tutoring. There are kids who just need a month or two, but it's sort of never too early to call Jen and start planning. It's never too early to call me and start planning. I mean, I'm a planner. I'm an organized person too, but I do see the benefit, and then it puts less pressure on your child. And when you call me in November of admission season and say, hey, we need to take the SSAT in 3 weeks, you can imagine how little time that is for us to be able to help your child become fluent in this foreign language.
Right. And I think getting Jen and yourself on board early, even to create an action plan, is probably a good way to go. That's what it's sounding like to me. Now, this next question, I think we addressed it a little bit, but do schools like to see recommendations from connected alumni? And is it like applying to kindergarten, where if somebody gives you a recommendation, you're expected to go to that school? I think you already addressed that, Jen,
Yeah,
but if there's
I
anything
did.
to elaborate.
So I would say, again, if the alumni knows your child very well, then it can definitely help in that file. I don't think it's the first thing that has to go into the file. I think it's something that could go in, you know, before January 15th, around that timeline. Let the admissions team see the whole file for the student as the student, and then they can start reading about people who have some influence, who are connected to your child. I will say, I think in most cases, whoever writes that letter would expect the child to go to the school. You know, that's an important letter to write, and they don't get very many of them. So I think that you are pretty committed if they write that letter, but that's really a question for them.
Fair enough. Thank you. I hope that answers the person's question. And the last question I'm seeing right now is, how do you have a good sense of whether your students' grades, test scores are the right caliber for a given school? So
Well, I would say call us.
I'm gonna
Yeah, I was gonna say you have to know the schools really well. They're
Yeah,
not
call
going to
both of
give
us.
you that information. You know,
Yeah.
there's some information about average SSAT scores online, and sometimes that's indicative of what kind of challenge you're looking at, but you got to call an expert. And you know, you have to know the schools. And I always say, because parents ask me all the time, are these SSAT scores good enough? Are these, you know, I've seen kids get in with all sorts of scores, but there's the exceptions and then there's the rule, right? And
Right.
so, you know, it doesn't mean you're out of the running if you're applying to a, you know, Trinity with scores that are not perfect, but there's the exception and then there's the rule. So you have to call someone who knows the scores and knows the schools. There's no other, the schools are not going to say that there's a cutoff and that you don't apply if you have certain scores or grades, but you know, there's what's competitive and what's not.
Yeah, and I would say that's true for other parts of the application. You know, again, it's not just one thing, it's really a combination of everything.
Okay, and if I was a parent coming to you with a child that's a sixth grader and we're totally up in the air, neither parent went to a private school and we really need help, where would you start us? I'm going to start with Jen and then go to Sasha on this.
And they're applying for 7th grade or for 8th grade, or we don't know.
We don't know. Let's say 7th grade.
Okay. Well, we would start with just interviewing the family and really understanding because oftentimes families come to us and they don't know. And so we get to understand really what page they're on. Then we interview the student and we put a plan together. You know, some children go away to junior boarding school. Some kids are better in an all-girls school. Some kids are single-sex school. Some kids are better in a co-ed school. So we really work with that student, getting to know that student really, really well. So that would be the starting point.
Okay, and from an academic perspective, Sasha?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same thing at Tutor Associates. We do a real deep dive into the child, whether it's for academics or test prep. There's always a consultation with the child and the family. And that consultation is meant to really deeply understand where that child is and what they need. And, you know, there are children who, you know, need a lot of help in one area and none in the other, or children who are more or less independent. And I'm sure, you know, I think our most independent kids are more likely to look at junior boardings or boarding schools and are maybe our ones who still need more guidance at home. I mean, I personally think my kids will be at home forever. I think they're gonna need mom forever. But I think, you know, there are kids who are real, you know, you get to know each child, and that's how we always propose a plan, be it for academic or for test preparation. It always starts with understanding the child and the family. And then we meet them where they are. And, you know, when you have time, it's nice.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think it's not just the academic piece, which goes back to actually a lot of these questions. It's really the social emotional piece too. You really need to understand the whole child in order to give a good placement and good recommendations.
That is very important and it's very critical. So I'd love for the two of you to wrap this up, giving sort of a summary if I could, and I'll start with you, Sasha, and then finish with Jen.
Sure. Well, we're deep into admissions now, right? We're in late September. I don't even know what day it is, which means it's a busy time. I think it always starts with a diagnostic when it comes to test prep. It's about picking the right test, and then it's about customized, child-centered test prep. And that's about tutors who understand your child and who understand that test really well and can bridge the gap for them and with them, and help them understand their own capacity as learners and as testers so that they're set up to feel confident, because they're going to encounter things like this for many years to come. And I think, call me, email me. I'm always here to give advice about these tests and about when and how and what you should send. There's always that moment in December where I get bombarded with test scores and they're like, should we send December and November? It's 1 point up on reading, it's down on verbal. So, I'm always here to talk about your child, because I think my final thing is that your child is not like every other child. And it's the same when it comes to testing. So we should chat about your child and their specific needs. We didn't get to chat about accommodations, but some children have accommodations, and we talk about whether or not they should use them and the benefits and some of the drawbacks. So super customized and really about bridging that gap so your child understands what they're capable of, which is there's sort of no ceiling there.
Yeah, I would say Sasha said everything I would say. I'd just like to add, every child is unique. And I go back to this point of, when you really get through all of this, you do understand who your child is. And that's the most important thing for a parent, is to highlight their strengths, work on their weaknesses, and get them to a place where they can grow into an independent, confident individual and take on the next stage of their life successfully.
So that's really important, and it's very important from all these aspects. And I think that if you can share, if there's a way that you'll be able to share your email addresses, perhaps to the people who've attended the session, so that if they have any additional questions or want to move in any kind of direction with you, that they would be able to do so. That would be great. Could that be done, or can it be put into the chat, do you think?
Yes.
I'm trying to figure out how to put it into the chat, because it makes me host, and it just wants me to text you guys. But I'm Sasha at tutораssociates.com. Nice and easy. Sasha, my name, SASHA at tutораssociates.com. And if you were invited by Jen, you can always email her, and she has my email. We will also send out a recording to anyone who wasn't able to make it or who wants to rewind it. But my favorite thing to do is to talk to parents about their teenagers test prep, which is a very niche thing to love to do, but I really do want to do that. So please email me, and we'll set up a time to chat.
Yeah, and mine is J as in Jennifer, B as in Bush, E as in Europe at virginiabush.com. That's BUSH.
E as in Europe is my favorite way to end this. I love that.
Sorry.
I'm going to start using that. I love that.
Sasha DeWind, Jennifer Bush, both of you have been great and obviously have a wealth of knowledge and can be so helpful to families and children, and have been for many, many years. And we look forward to your continuing to do so and your continued success. And for those families that are out there, you should think about this hard and long, and reach out. And any questions, feel free to reach out to them as well. And thank you all for attending. And we look forward to successful children.
Thank you, Sylvia. This was lovely.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.